At 07:10 hours on June 4, 1942, Ensign Albert Earnest strapped himself into the cockpit of a Grumman TBF Avenger at Eastern Island, Midway Atoll, preparing to fly a torpedo run he knew would probably kill him. Earnest was 25 years old, from Richmond, Virginia, 6 combat missions in total, 0 torpedo drops that had actually worked. The Japanese fleet had been spotted 180 miles northwest, 4 carriers, battleships, cruisers, the entire striking force of the Imperial Navy. Earnest would be flying straight into them with a weapon that failed 70% of the time. Radioman 3rd Class Harry Ferrier sat in the turret behind him, checking his .50 caliber machine gun. Ferrier was 17 years old, had joined the Navy straight out of high school in Springfield, Massachusetts. Seaman 1st Class J. Manning manned the belly gun. Manning was 19, from Seattle. They had been flying together for exactly 3 days. The TBF Avenger was the newest torpedo bomber in the American arsenal. Twin-row radial engine, 2,000 horsepower, 300 miles per hour at altitude. It could carry a 2,000-pound Mark 13 torpedo in its internal bomb bay. On paper, it was the most advanced torpedo bomber in the world. But the Avenger had one problem that was killing American pilots faster than Japanese fighters. Its torpedo didn't work. The Mark 13 had to be dropped from below 130 feet, at speeds under 130 miles per hour. Any faster, any higher, and the torpedo would break apart on impact with water. Even when dropped perfectly, 36% ran cold and never armed. 20% sank immediately. 20% veered off course. 18% ran at the wrong depth. Only 31% actually functioned as designed. The Navy knew this. The Bureau of Ordnance had documented every failure. Reports from Pearl Harbor, from the Coral Sea, from every 3 of engagement showed the same pattern. Torpedo after torpedo, failing to run, failing to arm, failing to explode. Pilots were dying trying to deliver weapons that wouldn't work. And everyone knew whose fault it was. The Naval Torpedo Station at Newport, Rhode Island. They controlled every aspect of torpedo production, had controlled it since 1923. One factory, one design bureau, one testing facility for the entire United States Navy. No competition, no alternative suppliers, no pressure to improve. Congressional representatives from Rhode Island protected Newport's monopoly. Any attempt to build torpedo factories elsewhere got blocked in committee. Any criticism of torpedo performance got buried in classified reports. The factory workers at Newport were on standard peacetime schedules, 40-hour weeks, no overtime. They were producing 100 Mark 13s per month when the Navy needed 500. Earnest took off as part of a 6-plane detachment led by Lieutenant Langdon Feebeling. Within an hour, 5 of the 6 Avengers would be shot down. Not one torpedo would explode. Feebeling would be dead. Charles Brannan would be dead. Oswald Gainier would be dead. Victor Lewis would be dead. Darrell Woodside would be dead. All their gunners would be dead. 15 men total, killed delivering torpedoes that wouldn't work even if they reached their targets. Only Earnest would survive, landing his shot-up Avenger with 64 bullet holes, 9 20mm cannon hits, his turret gunner Manning dead, Ferrier wounded. His torpedo had fallen out somewhere over the ocean, the release mechanism damaged by Japanese fire. He never knew if it would have worked. The problem wasn't pilot skill, it wasn't tactics. It wasn't even the aircraft. The problem was in the water, or more precisely, what happened when the torpedo hit the water. The Mark 13 torpedo was a 22.4-inch diameter weapon, 13 feet 5 inches, long, weighing 2,216 pounds. Inside its blunt nose was 600 pounds of Torpex explosive, 50% more powerful than TNT. The warhead alone should have been enough to cripple any ship it hit. But first it had to hit, and before it could hit, it had to run. And before it could run, it had to survive entering the water. Water is essentially incompressible. At high speed, hitting water is like hitting concrete. The Mark 13's internal mechanisms were designed in 1925 when aircraft flew at 80 miles per hour and dropped torpedoes from 50 feet. By 1942, Torpedo bombers were flying at 300 miles per hour, but the torpedo hadn't evolved. Its gyroscope, which controlled direction, would shatter if subjected to more than 10 Gs of deceleration. Water impact at 150 miles per hour created 15 Gs. The depth control mechanism, a simple hydrostatic valve and pendulum system, would jam if the torpedo entered at more than 30 degrees. The propeller shaft would bend if the torpedo hit at any angle other than perfectly flat. The Bureau of Ordnance knew these limitations. They had tested the Mark 13 extensively at Newport. Their solution was to restrict drop parameters so severely that torpedo bombers became sitting ducks. Fly straight and level at 130 miles per hour and 100 feet altitude directly at an enemy ship. Maintain that course for at least 10 seconds before drop to allow the torpedo's gyroscope to stabilize. Release at exactly 800 yards range. Any deviation meant torpedo failure. Following those parameters meant flying through concentrated anti-aircraft fire for 30 seconds or more. It was a death sentence. The Mark 13's difficulties had been documented as early as July 1941. During a training exercise with Torpedo Squadron 6, 10 torpedoes were dropped under perfect conditions. 5 went off course immediately. 4 sank. 1 ran somewhat normally. This was 11 months before Midway, 5 months before Pearl Harbor. The Navy's own testing at Naval Air Station Patuxent River showed that dropping the torpedo at anything over 150 knots caused the rear fins to collapse. The impact with water would crush the delicate steering mechanisms. The torpedo would either sink, run in circles, or porpoise along the surface. Sometimes the warhead would simply fall off. Analysis of recovered Mark 13 torpedoes after the Coral Sea battle in May 1942 revealed critical problems. 3 torpedoes that failed to detonate after perfect drops were examined. All 3 had intact warheads. All 3 had armed properly. The problem was the Mark 6 exploder mechanism. The firing pin was too fragile. When the torpedo hit a ship's hull at any angle other than perfectly perpendicular, the pin would bend or break before it could trigger the detonator. Engineers calculated that given the torpedo's speed and typical approach angles, the Mark 6 would fail to detonate approximately 40% of the time, even on direct hits. Reports documenting these failures were sent to the Bureau of Ordnance on May 20, 1942. They were classified secret and filed away. No action was taken. No modifications were approved. Pilots continued dying with defective weapons. By August 1942, American torpedo bomber losses in the Pacific were catastrophic. At Midway, 15 TBD Devastators from Hornet were shot down. None scored hits. 6 Avengers from Midway Island were attacked. 5 were shot down. No hits. At the Eastern Solomons, 7 Avengers were lost. They sank 1 light carrier, but only because multiple torpedoes were dropped and Japanese damage control failed. Most of the torpedoes that hit didn't explode. At the Battle of Santa Cruz in October 1942, the losses were even worse. Lieutenant Commander John Collett led Torpedo Squadron 10 from Enterprise against the Japanese carriers. His squadron dropped 12 torpedoes at the carrier Zuikaku from perfect position, textbook approaches at regulation, height and speed. 2 torpedoes hit, neither exploded. Collett's Avenger was shot down by Zeros immediately after. His gunner, aviation radioman 2nd Class William Woods, managed to transmit one final message. Torpedoes hit but no explosion. Tell them the torpedoes don't work. Woods was 19 years old. His body was never recovered. Ensign George Morgan from the same squadron survived Santa Cruz but wrote in his diary that night, "We might as well be dropping telephone poles for all the good these torpedoes do. Tommy Morrison got a perfect drop on a cruiser today. Saw it hit right amidships. Nothing. The torpedo just bounced off and sank. Tommy got shot down 30 seconds later. His last words on the radio were cursing the Bureau of Ordnance." Lieutenant Bruce Harwood of Torpedo Squadron 6 wrote a letter to his wife in November 1942 that was heavily censored but still conveyed his frustration. "We are being asked to do the impossible with equipment that's censored. I've lost 6 of my best friends in the last month, all flying perfect attacks that censored. If this war is lost, it won't be because of the pilots or the planes. It will be because censored won't admit censored and fix censored. The censors removed all references to torpedo failures, but Harwood's widow understood what he meant when she received his personal effects after he was killed at Guadalcanal in January 1943. The pilots knew. Every torpedo squadron in the Pacific knew their weapons were defective. They talked about it in ready rooms, wrote about it in letters home that censors redacted. But they kept flying the missions because that was their duty, and some of them started looking for their own solutions. The California Institute of Technology had been brought into the torpedo problem in late 1942, not by the Navy, but by the National Defense Research Committee, the civilian scientific board trying to mobilize American technology for war. The Navy hadn't asked for help. The Bureau of Ordnance insisted the Mark 13 was satisfactory. It was the pilots who were dropping them wrong. Dr. Charles Lauritsen didn't believe that. Lauritsen was a physicist at Caltech, had been working on rocket development when he was asked to look at the torpedo problem. He didn't know anything about torpedoes, but he knew about physics, about hydrodynamics, about what happened when objects hit water at high speed. In January 1943, Lauritsen's team set up a testing facility at Morris Dam, northeast of Los Angeles. They built a 300-foot slide down the face of the dam. At the bottom was Morris Reservoir, a mountain lake known for water clarity that allowed high-speed photography underwater. They started dropping torpedoes, not live ones, just weighted dummy units the same size and weight as Mark 13s. They filmed everything. High-speed cameras on the slide, underwater cameras in the reservoir, cameras on boats tracking the torpedo paths. The first thing they discovered was that the Navy's drop doctrine was completely wrong. The manual said to approach the target at a steady altitude and speed, release the torpedo at a specific distance, and maintain course until the torpedo hit the water. Lauritsen's films showed that this created the worst possible water entry. The torpedo would oscillate during its fall, swinging nose up and nose down like a pendulum. It would hit the water at random angles, sometimes flat, sometimes nose first, sometimes tail first. Each entry angle produced different failures. Flat impacts caused the torpedo body to flex. The 2,000-pound weapon would compress like an accordion, crushing internal components. The gyroscope would shatter. The depth control mechanism would jam. The propeller shaft would bend. Even if the torpedo managed to start running, it would veer off course or porpoise along the surface. Nose-first impacts drove the torpedo too deep. The Mark 13 was designed to run at 10 feet depth. A nose-first entry could send it down to 50 feet before the depth control mechanism could react. By then, it might be below the target's keel, or the pressure change might have damaged the warhead detonator. Tail-first impacts were the worst. The propeller and rudders would hit first, bending or breaking off completely. The torpedo would have no directional control, no propulsion. It would simply sink. Lauritsen calculated that at standard drop speeds there was only a 15-degree window of acceptable entry angles. The chance of a torpedo naturally falling within that window was less than 20%. What they found was that everything the Navy believed about torpedo drops was wrong. The doctrine said torpedoes should be dropped low and slow to minimize water impact. The films showed that low, slow drops caused the torpedo to belly flop. The flat impact would crush internal mechanisms even at slow speeds. The torpedo needed to enter the water at a specific angle, between 20 and 25 degrees. Too shallow and it would skip. Too steep and it would dive too deep or break apart. But achieving that angle from 100 feet at 130 miles per hour was nearly impossible. The pilot would have to judge distance, speed, altitude, and release point perfectly while being shot at by anti-aircraft fire. Lauritsen had an idea. What if the torpedo could be stabilized during its fall? What if they could control its entry angle regardless of drop height or speed? His team started experimenting with attachments, things that could be added to the torpedo to affect its flight characteristics. They tried small parachutes, too complex, too unreliable. They tried metal fins, too heavy, affected the torpedo's underwater performance. Then someone, nobody remembered exactly who, suggested looking at how the Japanese dropped their torpedoes. On December 7th, 1941, Japanese Kate torpedo bombers had devastated Pearl Harbor with their Type 91 torpedoes. Those torpedoes had been dropped from optimal heights and speeds, but they had wooden box fins attached to their tails. The boxes broke away on water impact, but they stabilized the torpedo during its fall. American intelligence had recovered several unexploded Type 91s from Pearl Harbor. The wooden attachments had been noted but dismissed as primitive, unnecessary for American torpedoes. The Japanese had spent 3 years developing those wooden box fins. They called them stabilizer plates. Japanese naval aviators training at Kagoshima Bay in 1939 had experienced the same problems American pilots were having with the Mark 13. Their Type 91 torpedoes, dropped from their Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers, failed more than half the time. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who would later lead the Pearl Harbor attack, had personally overseen tests of dozens of different stabilizer designs. The wooden box that finally worked was the result of over 2,000 test drops. But the Americans didn't know this history. They just saw crude wooden boxes and dismissed them. Lauritsen didn't dismiss anything. His team built their own wooden box fins and tested them at Morris Dam. They worked, but not well enough. The boxes created too much drag, slowing the torpedo so much that it lost forward momentum and tumbled. They needed something better. Dr. L.A. Dubridge, another Caltech physicist on Lauritsen's team, suggested an airfoil shape instead of a box. An airfoil would create less drag while still providing stability. They tried various designs, finally settling on a ring of aluminum shaped like an airplane wing in cross-section. The ring would fit around the torpedo's tail fins, held in place with 4 steel bolts. They called it a shroud ring. The first test of the shroud ring was on March 15, 1943. They dropped a dummy torpedo from the Morris Dam slide at a speed equivalent to a 200-knot aircraft release. The torpedo entered the water at exactly 22 degrees, the optimal angle they had calculated. It ran straight for 800 yards before they recovered it. The shroud ring was still attached, undamaged. They repeated the test 50 times. 48 torpedoes ran perfectly. 2 had minor deviations that were still within acceptable parameters. Lauritsen's team built their own version, not wooden boxes, but something better, a ring of aluminum in an airfoil shape that would fit around the torpedo's tail fins. They called it a shroud ring. In testing at Morris Dam, the shroud ring did 2 things. First, it stabilized the torpedo during its fall, keeping it from tumbling or oscillating. Second, it reinforced the fragile tail fins, preventing them from collapsing on impact. The shroud ring stayed attached underwater, but its airfoil shape actually improved the torpedo's underwater stability. Torpedoes with shroud rings ran straight and true. No more hooks, no more broaches, no more circular runs. But the shroud ring only solved half the problem. The torpedo still couldn't be dropped from high altitude or high speed. The impact force would still damage internal mechanisms. Lauritsen's team needed something to slow the torpedo's fall, to reduce its impact velocity. They experimented with various drag devices, fabric streamers that got tangled, metal plates that affected accuracy. Then they tried a simple plywood ring around the nose of the torpedo. It looked ridiculous, like a barrel wrapped around the warhead. The Navy pilots who first saw it started calling it the pickle barrel. The pickle barrel worked. It created drag during the fall, slowing the torpedo's descent by 40%. Combined with the shroud ring, it allowed the torpedo to be dropped from 800 feet at 260 knots and still enter the water at the correct angle and speed. The pickle barrel would break away on impact, leaving the torpedo to run normally. In April 1944, Lauritsen's team conducted a demonstration for Navy officials. 6 torpedoes were dropped from a Navy bomber at 1,000 feet, traveling at 300 knots. All 6 entered the water cleanly. All 6 ran hot, straight, and normal. The Navy officials were skeptical. These were laboratory conditions, controlled tests. Combat was different. Squadron mechanics had been waiting for something like this. When word of the Caltech modifications spread through unofficial channels in May 1944, mechanics and pilots began reaching out to Lauritsen directly. Could they get the modifications? Lauritsen said yes, but it would be unauthorized. The Bureau of Ordnance had not approved the modifications. They didn't care. Aviation machinists, mate first-class mechanics from multiple squadrons flew to California to learn the installation process. The meetings took place in a nondescript warehouse near the Naval Air Station. Lauritsen and his team had set up a workshop there, away from official Navy facilities. They couldn't risk Bureau of Ordnance inspectors discovering unauthorized torpedo modifications. The warehouse smelled of machine oil and fresh-cut plywood. Workbenches lined the walls, covered with torpedo parts, measuring instruments, and the strange-looking shroud rings and pickle barrels. Lauritsen personally showed the mechanics how to attach the modifications. The shroud ring installation was precise work. 4 holes had to be drilled through the torpedo's tail cone at exact locations. Too close to the edge and the aluminum might crack under stress. Too far inward and they would interfere with the control surfaces. The bolts had to be torqued to exactly 35 foot-pounds. Too loose, and the ring might shift during flight. Too tight, and it could deform the tail cone. The pickle barrel was simpler but still required precision. It was made from 3/4-inch marine plywood, cut into a ring 40 inches in diameter with a 24-inch center hole. The ring was split in half and hinged on one side, allowing it to be opened and placed around the torpedo's nose. 4 steel bands held it in place, tightened with turnbuckles to exactly 50 pounds of tension. The mechanics practiced on dummy torpedoes for days. Lauritsen's team watched, corrected, guided. They showed them how to check the alignment, how to test the attachment strength, how to ensure the modifications wouldn't interfere with the torpedo's loading into the Avenger's bomb bay. After training, they could install the modifications in 20 minutes. Lauritsen gave them detailed drawings of the modifications, precise measurements, materials specifications, and step-by-step installation instructions. Everything needed to replicate the work. The papers were stamped unofficial, not approved by Bureau of Ordnance in red letters. Lauritsen told them to share the information with other squadron mechanics, but quietly. If the Bureau found out about widespread, unauthorized modifications before they had combat proof of effectiveness, they would shut everything down. Lauritsen's team showed Chen how to attach the shroud rings and pickle barrels. The shroud ring was held in place with 4 bolts through the tail section. The pickle barrel was secured with metal bands around the torpedo body. The modifications added 32 pounds to the torpedo's weight, but that was negligible compared to the improvement in reliability. Chen returned to Yorktown and quietly modified 12 torpedoes. He did the work at night, after regular maintenance hours. He told the squadron's pilots what he was doing. They kept quiet. Better to ask forgiveness than permission. On June 19, 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, torpedo squadrons from Task Force 58 attacked the Japanese carrier Hio using modified torpedoes for the first time in combat. 8 Avengers dropped from 600 feet at 220 knots, higher and faster than any successful torpedo attack to date. 6 of 8 torpedoes ran true. 3 hit Hio. All 3 exploded. The carrier sank. It was the first time in the war that American aerial torpedoes had performed as designed in combat. The squadron leaders reported the success but didn't mention the modifications. They said their pilots had simply gotten lucky with their drops. But the other pilots in the strike noticed something different. The torpedoes had entered the water like arrows, with no splash, no tumbling, no deviation. Pilots who had seen dozens of torpedo drops knew this was different. After landing, mechanics throughout the task force were cornered by pilots asking what had been done to the torpedoes. The mechanics showed them the modifications. Within 12 hours, every torpedo in the fleet magazines was being fitted with shroud rings and pickle barrels. Mechanics worked through the night with teams of volunteers. By dawn on June 20th, when the carriers launched strikes against the retreating Japanese fleet, every Avenger carried a modified torpedo. The results were dramatic. Of 24 torpedoes dropped that day, 19 ran hot, straight, and normal. They sank 2 destroyers and damaged a cruiser. Not a single Avenger was lost to anti-aircraft fire. Word spread through Task Force 58 like wildfire. Pilots from Enterprise visited other carriers to see the modified torpedoes. Mechanics from Lexington flew over in COD aircraft to learn the installation process. Within a week, the installation drawings had been copied and distributed to every carrier in the FROMAS task force. The Bureau of Ordnance found out when staff inspectors visited carriers and found mechanics installing pickle barrels in broad daylight. The inspectors filed immediate reports demanding all modifications be removed and the responsible parties be court-martialed. The reports reached Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of Task Force 58. Mitcher had seen the combat results. He ordered the modifications to continue and told the Bureau that combat effectiveness took priority over regulations. The modifications continued. By August 1944, every torpedo squadron in the Pacific had shroud rings and pickle barrels. The official designation was Mark 13, Mod 2A, but pilots just called them ringtails. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October, Avengers sank the super battleship Musashi with multiple torpedo hits. In April 1945, they sank Musashi's sister ship Yamato, the same torpedoes that had failed so miserably in 1942 were now the most effective ship killers in the American arsenal. The Japanese noticed the change immediately. Commander Masataki Okumiya, air officer aboard carrier Junyo, wrote in his after-action report from the Philippine Sea that American torpedoes had suddenly become lethal. Where previously Japanese ships could absorb multiple hits, now single torpedoes were causing catastrophic damage. The Americans were dropping from heights and speeds that should have been impossible. Japanese anti-aircraft doctrine, based on forcing torpedo bombers down to low altitude, was suddenly obsolete. Captain Toshikazu Omai, operations officer for the combined fleet, conducted an analysis of American torpedo effectiveness in September 1944. He noted that American torpedo hit rates had increased from less than 10% in 1942 to over 40% by mid-1944. More disturbing, the percentage of hits that caused fatal damage had increased from 20% to 70%. The torpedoes were not only hitting more often, they were exploding reliably. Omei recommended that Japanese ships avoid combat with American carrier forces until the secret of the improved torpedoes could be discovered. The Japanese never found that secret. Lieutenant Commander Takashi Hashimoto, assigned to investigate captured American equipment, examined 4 recovered Mark 13 torpedoes in October 1944. He noted the strange plywood ring around the nose and the aluminum shroud around the tail, but dismissed them as shipping protections that would be removed before combat use. He couldn't conceive that such simple additions could transform the torpedo's performance. His report concluded that the Americans must have developed a new internal mechanism, possibly electronic, that stabilized the torpedo during flight. He recommended capturing intact Avengers for further study. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, commanding the Japanese center force at Leyte Gulf, reported that American torpedo attacks had become overwhelmingly effective. His flagship Yamato took 8 torpedo hits. The battleship Musashi took 19. Both ships had been considered unsinkable. Their torpedo defense systems, designed to handle the older, slower, less reliable American torpedoes, were overwhelmed. The Japanese never figured out what had changed. They examined crashed Avengers, recovered unexploded torpedoes, but the shroud rings and pickle barrels looked like original equipment. Without knowing about the Morris Dam tests, without understanding the hydrodynamics involved, they couldn't recognize the modifications as modifications. The psychological impact on Japanese naval forces was devastating. Commander Yoshima Yoshimura, executive officer of the cruiser Tone, wrote in his diary that American torpedo bombers had become demons of the sea. Where once Japanese sailors had watched torpedo attacks with confidence, knowing most torpedoes would miss or fail, now they watched in terror. The sight of Avengers approaching at high altitude, previously a sign they were carrying bombs, now meant torpedoes would soon be in the water. There was no safe altitude, no safe distance. The transformation in American torpedo effectiveness changed the entire Pacific Naval War. In 1942 and 43, Japanese surface forces operated with relative impunity. Their ships could absorb torpedo hits that didn't explode, could maneuver to avoid torpedoes that ran erratically. By 1944, Japanese ships were being hunted to extinction. The combined fleet that had seemed invincible after Pearl Harbor was reduced to scattered remnants hiding in harbor. The numbers told the story. In 1942, American torpedo bombers had achieved a hit rate of less than 5%. Of those hits, fewer than half exploded. By late 1944, hit rates exceeded tame 40%, and 95% of hits resulted in explosions. The kill rate per sortie had increased by a factor of 15. What had been the most dangerous and least effective mission in naval aviation became a precision ship-killing operation. At Leyte Gulf, the destruction was systematic. On October 24, 1944, waves of Avengers from Task Force 38 attacked the Japanese battleship Musashi. The first wave put 4 torpedoes into her port side. The ship listed but kept moving. The second wave put 3 more into her starboard side, correcting the list but flooding more compartments. The third wave put 4 more torpedoes into the port side. The fourth wave added 6 more hits. The fifth and final wave put 3 more torpedoes into the dying ship. Musashi rolled over and sank at 19:35 hours, taking over 1,000 men with her. Every one of those torpedoes had shroud rings and pickle barrels. They had been dropped from altitudes between 400 and 800 feet, at speeds between 180 and 260 knots. Under the old doctrine, those drop parameters would have guaranteed failure. With the Caltech modifications, they guaranteed success. The Musashi, which Japanese naval architects had designed to survive 20 torpedo hits, succumbed to 19 because every hit caused maximum damage. The following day, October 25th, Avengers found Yamato and her escorts off Samar. Lieutenant Commander William Isbell led 12 Avengers from Hancock in the attack. They approached at 8,000 feet, well above effective anti-aircraft range, then dove at 45-degree angles, releasing their torpedoes at 600 feet, while traveling at 250 knots. 10 of 12 torpedoes ran true. 8 hit various ships in the formation. Yamato took 3, the cruiser Nagato took 2, destroyers took the rest. All exploded. The formation scattered, disrupting the cruiser. Japanese attack on the American escort carriers off Samar. Lieutenant Robert Holcomb, flying one of those Avengers, wrote in his after-action report, "The torpedo entered the water with barely a splash and ran absolutely straight. No hook, no broach, no circular run. It was like watching a textbook demonstration. The explosion against Yamato's hull sent a column of water 200 feet high. For the first time since I started flying torpedo runs, I had complete confidence my weapon would work." The official Navy history credited improved pilot training and better tactics. The Bureau of Ordnance, in its 1946 final report, claimed that continuous refinement of the Mark 13 torpedo throughout the war resulted in steadily improving performance. They didn't mention that the refinements had come from civilian scientists working out official channels. They didn't mention that hundreds of pilots had died carrying defective weapons while Newport insisted nothing was wrong. Charles Lauritsen received the Presidential Medal for Merit in 1948. The citation mentioned his contributions to rocket development and underwater ordnance. It didn't specifically mention the torpedo modifications. Lauritsen went back to nuclear physics after the war, helped develop the hydrogen bomb, served on the Atomic Energy Commission. He rarely talked about his torpedo work. When asked, he would say they just applied basic physics to an engineering problem. Charles Lauritsen received the Presidential Medal for Merit in 1948. The citation mentioned his contributions to rocket development and underwater ordnance. It didn't specifically mention the torpedo modifications. Lauritsen went back to nuclear physics after the war, helped develop the hydrogen bomb, served on the Atomic Energy Commission. He rarely talked about his torpedo work. When asked, He would say they just applied basic physics to an engineering problem. The squadron, commanders who first used the unauthorized modifications, survived the war. They trained a generation of Navy pilots, telling them all the same story. Sometimes the system fails. Sometimes the official channels don't work. When that happens, you have to decide whether following regulations is more important than saving lives. They never regretted their decisions to use unauthorized modifications. The pilots who came back because of those modifications were justification enough. The mechanics who installed the modifications left the Navy after the war and returned to civilian life. They went back to their garages and machine shops across America. They had photographs on their office walls, standing next to Avengers with ringtail torpedoes loaded in the bomb bays. Customers would ask about them. They would say they worked on airplanes during the war. They didn't mention that their midnight modifications had helped sink the Japanese fleet. Aviation radioman First Class Harry Ferrier, the 17-year-old who had survived the June 4th Midway attack with Earnest, flew 47 more combat missions. Every time he climbed into an Avenger after August 1944, he knew his torpedo would work. He knew that someone, somewhere, had fixed the problem that had killed so many of his friends. He didn't know about Caltech or Morris Dam or the pickle barrels until years after the war. He just knew that suddenly, mysteriously, the torpedoes worked. Ferrier would describe the difference in a 1998 interview. Before the modifications, every torpedo run was a prayer. You'd watch the torpedo drop, see it hit the water, and hold your breath. Would it run? Would it explode? Usually, the answer was no. After late 44, it was completely different. The torpedo would drop, enter clean, and run true. You could actually see it tracking toward the target underwater, steady as a train on rails. When it hit, it exploded. Every time. It was like we had been given a completely new weapon. Lieutenant George Bush, the future president, flew 58 combat missions in Avengers from USS San Jacinto. On September 2, 1944, he was shot down over Chichijima while attacking a Japanese radio station. His two crew members, Lieutenant Junior Grade William White and Radioman Second Class John Delaney, were killed. Bush survived, rescued by the submarine USS Finback. But before being shot down, Bush had successfully delivered 4 modified torpedoes in previous missions, sinking a cargo ship and damaging a destroyer. In his memoir, Bush wrote about the difference the reliable torpedoes made to pilot morale. Knowing your weapon will work changes everything. You can focus on flying, on evading flak, on getting your crew home safe. You're not wondering if you're risking your life for nothing. Ensign Jesse Brown, the Navy's first African-American aviator, flew Avengers with Torpedo Squadron 32 from USS Leyte in late 1944 and 1945. Brown's squadron exclusively used ringtail torpedoes. In his first combat mission on January 4, 1945, Brown put a torpedo into a Japanese tanker off Formosa. The ship exploded and sank in 12 minutes. Brown would later say that having a weapon he could trust gave him the confidence to prove himself in a Navy that was skeptical of African-American pilots. He knew his success or failure would depend on his skill, not on defective equipment. The modifications saved American lives in ways that went beyond improved hit rates. Because pilots could drop from higher altitudes and faster speeds, they spent less time in anti-aircraft range. Because they could attack from multiple angles simultaneously, Japanese gunners couldn't concentrate their fire. Because more torpedoes hit and exploded, fewer missions were needed to sink each target. The Naval Aviation Safety Center calculated in 1946 that the torpedo modifications reduced Avenger combat losses by approximately 60% in the last year of the war. Ferrier lived until 2016, aged 90. He spent his last decades traveling to veteran reunions, telling the story of Torpedo Squadron 8, of the men who died at Midway carrying defective weapons. He would end his talks the same way every time. The brave young men who died in 1942 were not failed by their courage or their skill. They were failed by a system that valued bureaucratic control over combat effectiveness. Their sacrifice forced the changes that came later. Every Japanese ship sunk by torpedo after 1944 was vindication for the men who died in 1942 trying to deliver torpedoes that wouldn't work. The Bureau of Ordnance never officially acknowledged the failure of the Mark 13 torpedo in its original configuration. In a 1946 report to Congress, they stated that torpedo performance had been satisfactory throughout the war period with continuous improvements. They didn't mention that those improvements had been forced upon them by combat failures and civilian intervention. The report credited Newport with developing the shroud ring modification, even though the design came entirely from Caltech. It claimed the pickle barrel was a natural evolution of existing drag reduction research, ignoring that Newport had rejected drag devices for 3 years while pilots died. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, who had commanded amphibious forces throughout the Pacific War, wrote a private letter to Admiral King in December 1945. In it, he stated that the torpedo scandal of 1942 and 43 had cost the Navy more pilots than any tactical error. He estimated that proper torpedoes could have shortened the war by 6 months. The letter was classified and buried in Navy archives. Turner never spoke publicly about the torpedo problem. The families of the dead pilots never knew the truth. Barbara Feebeling, widow of Lieutenant Langdon Feebeling, who died leading the TBF detachment at Midway, spent 40 years believing her husband had died in a fair fight against superior Japanese forces. She didn't learn about the defective torpedoes until 1987, when a historian interviewed her for a book about Midway. She broke down crying, not from grief, but from anger. Her husband had died carrying a weapon the Navy knew was defective. Margaret Waldron, widow of Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, who led the 15 Devastators from Hornet, received a letter from President Roosevelt praising her husband's sacrifice. The letter mentioned his determined attack against overwhelming odds. It didn't mention that his squadron's torpedoes had less than a 30% chance of working even if they had reached their targets. Margaret kept that letter framed on her wall until she died in 1993. She never knew the full truth. The Newport Naval Torpedo Station continued as the Navy's primary torpedo facility until 1951. It was finally closed, and production dispersed to multiple contractors. The monopoly that had cost so many lives was quietly disbanded. No official investigation was ever conducted into why it took civilian scientists to fix a problem the Navy had known about since 1941. The classified reports documenting the Mark 13's failures remained sealed until 1972. The last surviving ringtail torpedo is on display at the National Museum of Naval Aviation in Pensacola. The placard mentions that modifications developed in 1944 improved the torpedo's effectiveness. It doesn't mention the pilots who died before those modifications. It doesn't mention that the modifications came from outside the Navy. It doesn't mention that they were initially unauthorized. History, as written by institutions, tends to omit institutional failures. But the real history, the one that matters, is simpler. A physicist who knew nothing about torpedoes looked at a problem with fresh eyes. A lieutenant commander risked his career to save his pilots. A mechanic worked through the night to install unauthorized modifications. Together, they turned the worst torpedo in the American arsenal into a ship killer that helped win the Pacific War. That's how technical innovation actually happens in war. Not through official channels or bureaucratic approval, but through people who see problems, find solutions, and don't wait for permission to save lives. The Grumman TBF Avenger became the best torpedo bomber of World War II, not because it was the fastest or most maneuverable or best armed, but because someone finally gave it a torpedo that worked. The aircraft had always been capable. The pilots had always been brave. They just needed a weapon they could trust. Between 1942 and 1945, 9008, 136 Avengers were built. They sank 29 Japanese aircraft carriers, battleships, and cruisers. They sank over 30 submarines. They dropped the torpedo that sent Yamato to the bottom, the largest battleship ever built. But their greatest victory wasn't measured in tonnage sunk. It was in proving that problems everyone knows about can be solved if someone is willing to break the rules. The wooden pickle barrel and aluminum shroud ring, developed in a mountain reservoir by physicists who had never been to sea, saved more American pilots than any improvement in aircraft design or pilot training. They turned the Battle of the Philippine Sea into what pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. They made the kamikaze attacks of 1945 an act of desperation by a navy that could no longer protect its ships with conventional forces. Today, every military acquisition program has multiple contractors, competitive bidding, independent testing. The lessons of the Mark 13 torpedo are built into the system, but those lessons were written in blood, paid for by the men who flew into Japanese anti-aircraft fire carrying weapons they knew probably wouldn't work, hoping that this time, maybe, the torpedo would run hot, straight, and normal. The true cost of the torpedo scandal has never been fully calculated. Historian Samuel Eliot Morison, in his official history of United States naval operations in World War II, devoted exactly 3 paragraphs to torpedo defects. He called them minor technical difficulties that were quickly resolved. This was the same historian who had access to all the classified reports, who interviewed hundreds of participants, who knew the full truth. But institutional history has a way of minimizing institutional failures. Dr. Norman Friedman, in his detailed technical history, U.S. Naval Weapons of World War II, calculated that proper torpedoes from the start of the war could have sunk an additional 40 to 50 major Japanese warships by the end of 1943. This would have included most of the carriers that later fought at Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf. The war might have been shortened by 6 months to a year. Thousands of American lives might have been saved. But the real cost can't be measured in ships or months or even lives. It was in the erosion of trust between the fighting forces and the bureaucracy that was supposed to support them. Every pilot who took off knowing his torpedo probably wouldn't work. Every mechanic who had to prepare aircraft for missions he knew were suicidal. Every squadron commander who had to write letters to widows knowing the deaths were preventable. They all learned the same lesson. Sometimes the system doesn't work. Sometimes the people in charge care more about protecting their positions than protecting the people doing the fighting. That lesson resonates today. In every military conflict since World War II, there have been equipment failures that everyone knew about, but no one could officially acknowledge. In Korea, bazookas that couldn't penetrate enemy armor. In Vietnam, M16 rifles that jammed in combat. In Iraq, Humvees without armor. In Afghanistan, radios that didn't work in mountains. Each time, the pattern was the same. The problem was known. The solution existed. But bureaucratic inertia, institutional pride, and political protection of contractors prevented fixes until public pressure or catastrophic failure forced change. The Grumman TBF Avenger went on to serve in Korea, where its reliability and payload capacity made it valuable for close air support. It served with foreign navies into the 1960s. Restored Avengers fly today at air shows. Their distinctive silhouette and growling radial engine remind us of an era when carrier aviation came of age. But few people watching them know the real story of how they became the best torpedo bomber of World War II. If you found this story compelling, take a moment to remember that behind every technical innovation in warfare, there are human beings who paid the price for institutional failure. The next time you hear about a military procurement scandal or a weapon system that doesn't work, remember the Mark 13 torpedo. Remember that somewhere, right now, young men and women are carrying equipment that someone, somewhere, knows is defective. And remember that it doesn't have to be that way. The best torpedo bomber of World War II wasn't determined by the aircraft, it was determined by the torpedo. And the best torpedo was created not by the system that was supposed to create it, but by people willing to work outside that system to save lives. That's the real lesson of the Avengers War.